Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to cover a work of Frederick Douglass called The Heroic Slave, a thrilling narrative of the adventures of Madison Washington in pursuit of liberty. Now, this work of Frederick Douglass is a piece of historical fiction, and it's called historical fiction because the mutiny upon this slave ship, where these slaves actually took control of a slave ship and sailed to Nassau under British control and gained their freedom, actually occurred. This event actually occurred. However, it's called historical fiction because the storyline building up to the main event and what actually occurred on the ship is the story given by Frederick Douglass, which can be considered fiction. Herman Melville also wrote a story about this same mutiny. So these accounts are historical fiction. However, you must realize that you still can't dismiss it as something that never happened, because many of the autobiographies that we read, those can be considered historical fictions also, because if you read an autobiography, you're getting that person's point of view of their own life and from their memory. And we all know that our minds are set to fill in gaps. And many of our memories of our own lives are things that our minds have made up and things that we've been told by our elders and our relatives, which never occurred. And if you don't believe me, go ahead and read an autobiography, such as the autobiography of Malcolm X, and then read a biography of Malcolm X, and you'll see that many of the facts that Malcolm portrayed of his own life as facts really didn't occur the way that he remembered it. Even in the narrative of Frederick Douglass that we just went over in the previous video, there's notes and things that parts of Frederick Douglass's life, his memory betrayed him, and so your mind fills in gaps. So when you hear something as historical fiction, don't just dismiss it and say, well, I don't like to read fiction because it never happened. Because many of these things that you read, these autobiographies that you read, they're not 100% accurate. Biographies that you read may have a little bit more accurate information. However, it's still written from the point of view of the author who wrote it during a certain time period. And since we're new historicists, we understand that all of these works, all of these bodies of literature are just one grand work, which are representative of certain time periods, which is the time period of the author who wrote that body of work. And I've covered some of these aspects of new historicism in previous videos. But what we get from this story, which I recommend that everyone read, I'm going to say it again, The Heroic Slave, a thrilling narrative of the adventures of Madison Washington in pursuit of liberty. And this is my Kindle. I don't buy actual books of everything that we go over, and I have a earlier video of books that I recommend, and someone left a comment saying, well, why don't you show the books? Because I don't have all of the books to hold up like I have Infants of the Spring. I don't have all of these books. I have them in my Kindle, so I can have all of these books just right at my fingertips. So I recommend that everyone get a Kindle. But what we get from this story are aspects of a fugitive slave, a runaway slave, that that Frederick Douglass didn't put in his narrative because he didn't want to expose any actual people in his own narrative. So in this story of Madison, Washington, we do get aspects of what an escaping slave faces as he escapes. Now, the beginning of the story, Madison is a slave and he's releasing his feelings. He's talking to himself and he gets overheard by an abolitionist. And then Madison, Washington gets up his courage. He escapes, and along his journey, he runs into the abolitionist that overheard his speaking, and this abolitionist helps Madison along his journey. Now, this just shows that many of the fugitive slaves, if not all of the fugitive slaves who escaped and won their freedom, had to receive some sort of help from white abolitionists. The Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, all of these slaves or all of these blacks who were escaping slavery, I don't like to just call them slaves, but all of the blacks escaping slavery received some sort of assistance from sympathetic whites. They couldn't just do it all themselves, and Frederick Douglass is demonstrating this in this book. I keep wanting to call it a narrative, but it's a story. And he talks about following the North Star. Many of the slaves knew that they had to go up north, so they followed the North Star in their journey. And Madison, Washington was not planning on stopping in Ohio, just in the North, because the North had the Fugitive Slave Act. So really, blacks escaping slavery couldn't just stop in the North, because if they stopped in the North, they still had to risk being returned to slavery because of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was enacted in the North. So the slaves, the blacks, were actually trying to escape up into Canada if they got the chance. And this just brings back thoughts of the 4th of July and the United States getting their independence, and why we shouldn't celebrate it, because it would have been better off for blacks had the U.S. never received its independence, because England actually outlawed slavery way before the United States did. And that's going to be demonstrated in this writing also, because on this mutiny upon the slave ship, they escaped the U.S. on a slave. They took over a slave ship, and then they sailed this slave ship to Nassau, which was under English control. And England had already outlawed slavery, so all the slaves, all the blacks that were slaves on this ship, once they reached that country, they were freed. And that's all accounted in this really eloquently in this story. So, in this, what was very interesting in this writing is Frederick Douglass. He explains that he can't explain the feeling that the slave had during various events in the story. He said, I can't explain the pathos. So you look up the word pathos, it's the feeling. He could, the feelings and the emotions. So, like, if you think about it, to win your freedom after a life of slavery, you can't explain in words that feeling. Also, imagine if you were on a slave ship, shackled in chains, and at one point you find yourself free and able to put hands on those who had you shackled. You know, you can't write down the feeling that you would have if you're like, I'm shackled, I can't do anything, this person has control of me, and then just imagine like something happens to the ship and you find yourself free and able to go toe to toe with this person that had advantage of you when you were shackled. You can't explain that in words. You can only demonstrate that through actions. So, you know, Frederick Douglass says, I can't explain the pathos while he's writing this story. And so Madison, Washington, he was a slave, and his name, Madison Washington, is also demonstrative of what slaves did back in the day when they would win their freedom. They would change their name to the names of powerful men. Madison Washington. George Washington was the first president. James Madison was the second president. So this guy's name is Madison Washington. And one of the captains of the slave ship survived and was giving the account of what happened on this mutiny to one of his fellow Americans. He said that the black man, Madison Washington, was leading the mutiny with all of the command and grace of the names of the men that he bore. So Madison and Washington. And he said that Madison Washington was a man that he would not hesitate to follow and allow him to lead had he been white. He said the only thing that why I wouldn't follow him is because his skin is black. So that's addressed, and you can clearly see that this is a writing supporting the abolition of slavery, because Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist once he won his freedom. Now, Madison Washington got his freedom with the aid of an abolitionist. He went up north, he was free, and then during a journey, the abolitionist sees Madison Washington going down south in chains. And he said, why are you here? Like, we went through all the steps, you had your freedom. And Madison Washington said, I couldn't bear to leave my wife in slavery while I was walking free. So this reminds me, in the narrative of Frederick Douglass, which you should read that before you read this, because the narrative will allow you to recognize things in this story that you may not, focus on beforehand. Because in the narrative, Frederick Douglass said that he almost didn't want to gain his freedom because of the people that he would be leaving behind, friends, family, acquaintances, and people that he cared much about. And he said that there are thousands of blacks who did not leave slavery because they did not want to leave behind the people with whom they had connections and relationships with. Now, we all know the connections and relationships that we have with friends and families, and it does affect our decisions when we may be thinking today of moving to another state for a job or moving to another state just for circumstances. So that impacts us now. So just imagine if you were living in slavery and you have to turn to other people in your situation every day just for safety, you don't want to leave them. So Madison Washington won his freedom, but he returned for his wife. Now, this part of the story kind of upsets me a little bit, because he returns for his wife, and while he's trying to escape with his wife gets shot and she dies. And Frederick Douglass doesn't expound on Madison Washington's feelings about the death of his wife. It just kind of glosses over that and gets to the mutiny. Now, the mutiny on the slave ship, you should read it and see how it occurred. And you should also read Benito Sereno by Herman Melville, because he accounts of how the mutiny occurred. And the accounts are different. However, the main premises of how the mutiny was successful is the same in both stories. And it's because the white men who were controlling the slave ship actually believed in the discourse of the United States, which painted black people as inferior, ignorant, and unable to manage, even if they did gain their freedom. So now I've talked to you about what discourse is. Like those in control, and one way that they maintain control is they create information, they create a narrative, they spread out the narrative, and then they sustain the narrative, and then those who accept the narrative or accept the information, that information becomes truth. And some of the discourse in the U.S. is that black people are inferior and unable to manage and control and govern themselves. So on this slave ship, they underestimated the intelligence of the black people on that slave ship. They put their guard down, and the slaves uprised, they rebelled, and they took control of the slave ship. And Madison Washington guided the slave ship towards Nassau, where they gained their freedom. Now, I highlighted a part of this story which really stood out to me, and this is where Frederick Douglass actually defines the system of white supremacy in the United States, which held true in this story, and I really believe that it holds true today. And you'll see that illustrated as I read it, and after I read it, you can compare it to what we see occurring in the United States today with the police force, the court system, and all of these blacks getting murdered and no one being punished for it. And this is a conversation that one of the captains of the slave ship had with one of his fellow Americans, who was trying to say, like, I wish I was on that slave ship, because if I was on that slave ship, none of this would have happened, because I know how to manage my Negroes. He said, I know how to manage my niggers, and they don't have the intelligence and the strength to resist my rule if I was on that slave ship. And this was the man's response. It is quite easy to talk of flogging niggers here on land, where you have the sympathy of the community and the whole physical force of the government, state and national, at your command, and where, if a Negro shall lift his hand against a white man, the white community with one accord are ready to unite in shooting him down. I say, in such circumstances, it is easy to talk of flogging Negroes and of Negro cowardice. So that is the definition of white supremacy. You know, that paragraph right there tells us, God, we have a whole system here on land to make sure that we maintain control over blacks. And we got the whole community. He said we got the whole physical force of government, state, and national at your command, which we see here today when the police officer shoots a black person, if he's running or if he's unarmed. He goes to court. He has the jury on his side. He has the judge, the whole country, everything in place for him to get his freedom. And we see that play out over and over and over again. So Frederick Douglass writes about it here during his time period, and it still holds true today. So we should continue to read these books, read these narratives, and create our own narrative. So, The Heroic Slave, a thrilling narrative of the adventures of Madison Washington in pursuit of liberty by Frederick Douglass. Again, this is Jason Williams with Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.